When the doorbell rang that Tuesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea. I remember the kettle was just starting to whistle, and I had flour on my hands from rolling out dough for apple pie. 20 years of living alone had made me comfortable with silence, with the predictable rhythm of my days. I had learned to fill the empty spaces with small rituals. The doorbell was unexpected. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked slowly to the front door, wondering if it was the mailman with a package or maybe my neighbor Carol stopping by to borrow sugar again. I opened the door and my breath caught in my throat. Standing there on my porch, older and grayer but unmistakably him, was Richard. My husband. The man who had walked out of this house 2 decades ago and never looked back. He was wearing a brown jacket I didn't recognize, and his hair had gone completely white at the temples. His face had more lines now, deep creases around his eyes and mouth. But it was him. After 20 years of silence, after 20 years of building a life without him, he was standing at my door like he'd just gone out for groceries. He looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. Not shame exactly. Not regret either. It was more like entitlement, like expectation. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to slam the door. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him where he'd been, why he'd left, how he could possibly think it was okay to just show up after all this time. But I didn't do any of those things. I just stood there, holding the edge of the door, feeling the floor tilt under my feet. Richard spoke first. His voice was the same, that low rumble I used to find comforting. "Hello, Margaret," he said. "I need to talk to you about the house." Not "hello, how have you been?" Not "I'm sorry for leaving." Not "I know I hurt you." Just straight to business, like we were strangers negotiating a transaction. "I'm taking back my house," he said. Those were his exact words. "I'm taking back my house." Like the 20 years I'd lived here alone meant nothing. Like the mortgage payments I'd made every single month meant nothing. Like the garden I'd planted and the walls I'd painted and the life I'd rebuilt from nothing meant absolutely nothing at all. I felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like disbelief, like I was watching a scene in a movie that didn't make sense. I stepped back and let him in because I didn't know what else to do. He walked into the living room like he owned the place, which I suppose he thought he did. He sat down on my couch, the one I'd bought 5 years ago from a furniture sale downtown. He looked around the room with this expression of casual assessment, like he was inspecting a property he was thinking of buying. I stood in the doorway with my arms crossed, still wearing my flour-dusted apron. My mind was racing, but my body felt frozen. Richard looked at me and said he'd been thinking about coming back for a while now. He said he'd made some mistakes, but he was ready to settle down again. He said this house was still technically in both our names, and he wanted to move back in. He said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Like 20 years was nothing. Like I was nothing. That's when something inside me shifted. The shock began to fade, and underneath it I found something solid. Something strong. I had spent 2 decades learning how to stand on my own feet. I had cried myself to sleep for the first year after he left. I had struggled to pay the bills and keep the house and raise our daughter by myself. I had learned how to fix a leaking faucet and change a tire and do my own taxes. I had built a life without him. And now he thought he could just walk back in and take it all away. I looked at Richard sitting on my couch, and I said very quietly, "We need to talk about what happened while you were gone. I need to show you something." He looked surprised, like he'd expected me to just accept his announcement without question. But I walked over to my desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a folder I kept in the top drawer. Inside was every important document related to this house. And right on top was the deed. The new deed. The one that had only my name on it. Let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the 20 years you missed while you were out living whatever life you chose over this one. Let me tell you about the woman you left behind and the woman she became. Richard and I got married when I was 23 years old. He was 25, fresh out of college with a business degree and big dreams about starting his own company. I was working as a secretary at a law firm downtown, saving every penny I could. We were young and in love, or at least I thought we were. We bought this house together a year after the wedding. It was small, just 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, but it was ours. I remember the day we got the keys. I remember how Richard picked me up and carried me over the threshold like we were in some romantic movie. I remember thinking this was the beginning of our forever. Our daughter Emily was born 3 years later. She had Richard's dark hair and my green eyes, and from the moment they placed her in my arms, I knew my life would never be the same. Richard was a good father in those early years. He would come home from work and toss Emily in the air until she giggled. He would read her bedtime stories in funny voices. He would tell me he loved me and that we were going to build something beautiful together. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. Richard's business ventures never quite worked out the way he planned. He would get excited about a new idea, pour all his energy and our money into it, and then watch it fall apart. Each failure made him more bitter, more distant. He started staying late at work, or at least that's what he told me. He started drinking more. We started fighting more. Not loud, explosive fights, but quiet, cold ones where the silence hurt more than any shouting ever could. I tried to hold things together. I kept working, kept taking care of Emily, kept making dinners that Richard often didn't come home to eat. I told myself this was just a rough patch, that every marriage went through hard times. I told myself he would come back to me eventually. I told myself I was being patient and supportive and all the things a good wife was supposed to be. Then one morning I woke up and he was gone. Not gone to work, just gone. His clothes were missing from the closet. His toothbrush was gone from the bathroom. There was no note, no explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty space where my husband used to be. Emily was 8 years old. I had to tell her that Daddy had left and I didn't know when he was coming back. I had to watch her little face crumple as she tried to understand why her father would leave without saying goodbye. I had to pretend I was strong when inside I felt like I was breaking into 1,000 pieces. The first few months were the hardest. I couldn't afford the mortgage on my salary alone. I had to take on a second job waiting tables at a diner on weekends. Emily stayed with my mother during those shifts. I would come home exhausted at midnight smelling like grease and coffee, and I would sit in the dark living room and wonder what I'd done wrong. I wondered if I'd been a bad wife. I wondered if I'd driven him away somehow. I wondered if he was ever coming back. He didn't. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years. I never heard from him. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a single word to explain why he'd left or where he'd gone. Eventually, I hired a lawyer and filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. It took a while because we couldn't locate Richard to serve him papers, but eventually the divorce went through. The judge granted me full custody of Emily, which felt like a bitter victory because Richard had never even contested it. He just didn't show up. Didn't care enough to show up. The house became my anchor and my burden. Every month I struggled to make that mortgage payment. I cut coupons and bought store brands and wore the same 3 outfits to work on rotation. I planted a vegetable garden in the backyard to save money on groceries. I learned how to do basic repairs myself because I couldn't afford to call a handyman. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers in my head, trying to figure out how to stretch $20 until the next paycheck. But slowly, painfully, I figured it out. I got a raise at the law firm. Then another one. I stopped working at the diner after 5 years because I could finally make ends meet with just one job. Emily grew up into a smart, kind, resilient young woman despite everything. She never heard me badmouth her father, even though I had every right to. I told her people sometimes make choices we don't understand, and all we can do is keep loving them anyway. 10 years after Richard left, I finally paid off the mortgage. I made that last payment, and I sat in my kitchen and cried. They were good tears, proud tears. I had done it. By myself, I had kept her home. I had given Emily stability. I had survived. But there was still a problem. Technically, Richard's name was still on the deed. He'd abandoned us, disappeared without a trace, but legally, he was still part owner of this house. My lawyer told me that after 7 years of abandonment, I could petition the court to remove him from the deed. It was a complicated process. I had to prove that Richard had abandoned the property, that I'd made all the payments, that I'd tried to contact him without success. I had to gather bank statements and mortgage records and testimony from neighbors who could confirm he'd been gone. It took almost 2 years to work through the legal system, but finally, 12 years after Richard walked out, a judge signed an order transferring full ownership of the house to me. I had the deed reissued with only my name on it. Margaret Louise Patterson. Not Margaret and Richard Patterson. Just me. That piece of paper meant more to me than almost anything. It was proof that I'd earned this house. It was mine because I'd fought for it and sacrificed for it and refused to give up on it. Emily went to college on scholarships and student loans. She studied hard and graduated with honors. She got a good job in the city and moved into her own apartment. I was so proud of her. She had grown up without a father, watching her mother struggle, but she turned into someone amazing anyway. She called me every Sunday, and we'd talk for hours. She'd tell me about her life, and I'd tell her about mine. We never talked about Richard. He was like a ghost we'd both agreed to stop acknowledging. I settled into my life as a single woman. I was 56 years old, financially stable for the first time in decades, living alone in a house that was finally, truly mine. I joined a book club. I took up watercolor painting. I volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. I made peace with my loneliness. I even went on a few dates that my friend Carol set up for me, though nothing ever came of them. I was okay with that. I'd learned that I didn't need someone else to make me whole. I was already whole on my own. And then Richard showed up at my door talking about taking back his house. I handed him the folder with the deed. He opened it slowly, his expression skeptical, like he thought I was bluffing. I watched his face change as he read the document. His eyebrows drew together. His mouth pressed into a thin line. He looked up at me with something like surprise. "You had me removed from the deed," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I did. 12 years ago." He set the folder down on the coffee table and leaned back on the couch. He rubbed his hand over his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. I could hear a car drive past outside. I could hear my own heartbeat still thudding in my chest. Richard finally looked at me and said, "I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you had done that." I sat down in the armchair across from him. My legs were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. "What did you expect, Richard?" I asked. "Did you think you could just disappear for 20 years and everything would stay frozen in time waiting for you? Did you think I would just sit here hoping you'd come back?" He didn't answer. He just looked at the floor. I went on. "I paid every single mortgage payment by myself. I kept this house standing by myself. I raised Emily by myself. You left us with nothing. No explanation, no money, no help. Nothing. And now you show up and think you can just take it back?" Richard looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "Look," he said, "I know I made mistakes. I know I should have handled things differently. But I was going through a hard time back then. My business failed. I was depressed. I felt like a failure as a husband and a father. I thought you and Emily would be better off without me." It was the same old excuse people always give when they abandon their responsibilities. "I was doing it for you." As if disappearing without a word was somehow a noble sacrifice. I shook my head. "You don't get to do that," I said quietly. "You don't get to make decisions for other people and then claim it was for their own good. You left because it was easier than staying. You left because you didn't want to face your problems. You left because you were a coward. And that's fine. You get to make your own choices. But you don't get to come back 20 years later and pretend you still have a claim to the life you abandoned." Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to me talking to him like this. When we were married, I'd been softer, more accommodating. I'd swallowed my hurt and tried to keep the peace. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "This is still my house too," he said, his voice harder now. "I helped pay for it. My name was on the mortgage. You can't just erase me like I never existed." I pulled the deed out of the folder and held it up. "Actually," I said, "I can." And I did. "The court agreed that you abandoned this property. You have no legal claim to it anymore. This house is mine." He stared at the deed in my hand like it was a weapon pointed at him. Then where am I supposed to go? He asked, and for the first time I heard something vulnerable in his voice. I don't know, Richard, I said. Where have you been for the last 20 years? Where did you go when you left us? He looked away. I traveled, he said. Worked odd jobs. Stayed with friends. I was in California for a while. Then Nevada. Then Arizona. I just kept moving. Couldn't seem to settle anywhere. I felt a flash of something that might have been pity, but I pushed it down. You made your choices, I said. You chose to leave. You chose to stay gone. You chose not to send child support or even a birthday card to your daughter. You chose all of that. And I chose to survive. I chose to keep going. I chose to protect what was mine. Those were my choices. You don't get to walk back in now and undo them. Richard stood up suddenly. His face was flushed. This isn't fair, he said. I'm still your husband. You can't just throw me out. I stood up too, facing him. We're not married anymore, I said. We got divorced 15 years ago. You were served papers. You didn't contest it. It's done. He looked genuinely shocked. Divorced? He said. I never signed anything. You didn't have to, I said. After 7 years of abandonment, the court granted it, without your signature. You had every chance to object. You didn't. So yes, Richard. We are divorced. You have no claim to me, and no claim to this house. He looked around the living room like he was seeing it for the first time. I could see him taking in all the changes. The new furniture. The fresh paint on the walls. The photos on the mantle of Emily graduating college, Emily at her first job, Emily and me on vacation together. Photos of a life he'd missed. A life that had gone on without him. He looked lost, like a man waking up in a place he didn't recognize. I never meant for things to turn out like this, he said quietly. I know, I said. But they did. We stood there in silence. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. I'd won. I had the deed. I had the law on my side. I had every right to send him away and never think about him again. But instead I just felt tired. Tired of carrying this old hurt. Tired of the anger I'd held onto for so long. Tired of being the woman who'd been abandoned. I wanted to let it go. Not for him. For me. Why did you really come back? I asked. Richard sat back down. His shoulders slumped. He suddenly looked very old and very tired. I'm 62, he said. I've got health problems. Heart condition. Nothing major yet, but the doctor says I need to slow down. Take better care of myself. I don't have much money saved. I thought maybe I could come back here. Maybe we could work something out. I realized I needed a home. I realized I'd left behind the only real home I'd ever had. There it was. The truth. He hadn't come back because he missed me or because he wanted to make amends. He'd come back because he needed something. Because he was scared and alone and running out of options. I wanted to feel angry about that, but I couldn't quite manage it. I just felt sad. Sad for both of us. Sad for all the years we'd wasted. Sad for the marriage that had died so long ago. I sat back down in my chair. Richard, I said gently, I understand that you're scared. I understand that you need help. But you can't come back here. Not like this. Not by demanding. Not by trying to take what isn't yours anymore. You burned this bridge 20 years ago. You don't get to just walk back across it now. He nodded slowly. His eyes were red, but he didn't cry. I messed up, didn't I? He said. Yeah, I said. You did. And so did I. I should have fought harder to find you. I should have made you deal with your responsibilities. I let you disappear because it was easier than fighting. We both made mistakes. What happens now? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. I think you need to leave. I think you need to figure out your own life without expecting me to save you. But I also think you need to talk to your daughter. Emily deserves to know you're alive. She deserves the chance to decide whether she wants you in her life or not. Richard looked up at me. Does she hate me? He asked. I don't know, I said. You'll have to ask her yourself. I wrote down Emily's phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to him. Call her, I said. Tell her the truth. Apologize. Don't expect her to forgive you, but give her the chance to hear from you. Richard took the paper and stared at it. Then he looked at me with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said. "For all of it. I'm sorry, I wasn't the man you needed me to be." "I know," I said. "I forgave you a long time ago. Not because you deserved it, but because I needed to move on. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to how things were. It just means I'm not carrying your mistakes around anymore." He stood up to leave. At the door, he turned back and looked at me one more time. "You look good," he said. "Happy. You did a good job with Emily. With the house. With everything. You should be proud." "I am proud," I said. "I worked hard for this life. And I'm not letting anyone take it from me. Not even you. Especially not you." He nodded and walked out. I watched him get into an old beat-up truck parked on the street and drive away. When he was gone, I closed the door and locked it. I stood there for a long moment with my hand on the doorknob, feeling the weight of 20 years lift off my shoulders. Then I went back to the kitchen. The kettle had gone cold, so I filled it again and turned on the stove. I went back to rolling out my pie dough. My hands were steady now. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not lonely, just peaceful. I finished making my pie and put it in the oven. While it baked, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about everything that had happened. Richard had come back hoping to reclaim what he'd lost, but he'd found out he couldn't. You can't abandon something for 20 years and expect it to still be yours. Life doesn't work that way. People move on. They heal. They rebuild. They become new versions of themselves. I wasn't the woman Richard had left behind. That woman had been uncertain and dependent and afraid. This woman was strong and independent and sure of herself. This woman had fought for every single thing she had. And she wasn't giving any of it up. I thought about calling Emily to warn her that her father might reach out, but I decided against it. She was an adult. She could handle it. Whatever happened between them was their journey now, not mine. I'd done my part. I'd raised her right. I'd taught her to be strong and kind and forgiving, but also to protect herself. She would figure out what she needed to do. The doorbell rang again about an hour later, and my heart jumped, thinking Richard had come back. But when I opened the door, it was Carol from next door holding a casserole dish. "I made too much lasagna," she said with a smile. "Thought you might want some." I took the dish and invited her in for coffee. We sat at my kitchen table and talked about nothing important. Garden plans and book club and her grandson's upcoming wedding. Normal, everyday things. She didn't ask why I seemed distracted, and I didn't tell her. Some stories you need to sit with for a while before you can share them. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling like I'd done so many times over the years. But this time I wasn't worried about money or scared about the future or wondering if I'd made the right choices. I knew I had. Every decision I'd made had led me here. To this house that was mine. To this life that I'd built. To this version of myself that I was proud of. Richard's return had been a test, and I'd passed it. Not by being cruel or vindictive, but by standing firm. By knowing my worth. By refusing to let someone else's chaos become my problem. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Richard, more than I wanted to. I wondered where he'd gone. I wondered if he'd called Emily. I wondered if he was okay. Despite everything he'd put me through, I didn't wish him harm. I just wanted him to figure out his own life, without dragging me back into it. I'd spent 20 years untangling myself from his choices. I wasn't about to get knotted up in them again. About a week later, Emily called. "Mom," she said, her voice careful. "Dad called me." My heart squeezed. "I know," I said. He came to the house. She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it wasn't my story to tell," I said. "What did he say to you?" She sighed. "He apologized. Said he'd made mistakes. Asked if we could meet for coffee. I told him I needed time to think about it." She paused. "Are you okay, Mom?" I smiled, even though she couldn't see me. "I'm okay, honey," I said. This was a surprise, but I handled it. He thought he could take the house back, but I showed him the deed. He has no claim on anything anymore. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked again. I could hear the worry in her voice. "Yes," I said firmly. "I am absolutely sure. Your father and I are ancient history. Whatever you decide to do about seeing him is completely up to you, and I will support you either way." She was quiet again. I don't know if I want to see him, she admitted. Part of me is curious. Part of me wants to tell him off. Part of me just wants to pretend he never came back. All of those feelings are valid, I said. You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. And remember, you don't owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even a conversation. Whatever you choose, make sure it's for you and not for him. Thank you, Mom, she said softly. For everything. For being there. For being strong. For showing me what it looks like to stand up for yourself. I felt tears prick my eyes. You're welcome, baby, I said. That's what mothers do. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. I thought about all the ways Richard's leaving had shaped us. It had hurt us, yes. It had made things harder than they needed to be. But it had also made us stronger. It had taught Emily resilience. It had taught me independence. It had forced us both to discover capabilities we didn't know we had. In a strange way, Richard's worst mistake had become our greatest teacher. I decided I needed to do something symbolic to mark this moment. I went to my desk and pulled out the old deed, the one with both our names on it that I'd kept filed away with all the divorce papers. I hadn't looked at it in years. Now I held it in my hands and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just nothing. It was a piece of paper documenting a life that no longer existed. I took it outside to the fire pit in the backyard. I struck a match and watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened and turned to ash. When it was gone, I felt lighter. Spring came, and I planted new flowers in the garden. Bright yellow daisies and purple irises and red tulips. I painted the shutters a cheerful blue. I bought new curtains for the living room. I was making this house even more mine, erasing the last traces of the past. Carol came over and helped me hang the curtains. She stood back and admired them and said, "This place really feels like you now." "It does," I agreed. "It really does." I never saw Richard again. Emily eventually decided to meet him for coffee. She came over afterward and told me about it. "We met at that little cafe downtown," she said. "He looks old, Mom." He apologized again. He tried to explain why he left. Some stuff about feeling like a failure and being depressed and thinking we'd be better off without him. "Did you believe him?" I asked. She shrugged. "I think he believed it at the time. I think he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. But it was still selfish. He still chose the easy way out." "Are you going to see him again?" I asked. She shook her head. "I told him I appreciate the apology, but I don't want a relationship with him. He wasn't there for my childhood. He doesn't get to show up now and pretend to be my dad. He took it better than I expected. I think he knew that was coming." "Good," I said. "You did the right thing for you." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm glad I got to tell him how I felt, though. I'm glad I got that closure." "So am I, honey," I said. "So am I." Months passed, and life went on. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Richard had moved to a different state. He'd found work doing something or other and was renting a small apartment. I was glad he'd landed on his feet, but I didn't think about him much. He'd become what he should have been all along, a stranger who used to be part of my life. Someone I once knew. Nothing more. I spent more time with friends. I took a pottery class and discovered I had a knack for making bowls. I went on a weekend trip with Carol to the mountains, and we hiked and laughed and ate too much chocolate. I felt young again. Not young like I was when I married Richard and thought I knew what life would be. Young like I was discovering life for the first time with no expectations and no fear. Just openness. One evening I was sitting on my front porch watching the sunset when my neighbor's little grandson ran over. He was maybe 6 years old with messy hair and a gap-toothed smile. "Miss Margaret," he said breathlessly, "my grandma says can she borrow some sugar?" "Of course," I said. "Come on in." I gave him a cup of sugar and a cookie for the road. He thanked me and ran back across the lawn. I watched him go and I smiled. This was my life now. Simple. Kind. Full of small good moments. I thought about the woman I'd been 20 years ago when Richard left. She would never have believed she'd end up here. Strong and content and completely self-sufficient. She would never have believed she could survive losing her husband, raising a child alone, keeping a house, building a career, and coming out the other side not just okay, but actually happy. But she had. I had. And I was proud of that. People always say that forgiveness is for you, not for the other person. I never really understood what that meant until now. Forgiving Richard didn't mean what he did was okay. It didn't mean I forgot or excused it. It just meant I stopped letting it take up space in my heart. I stopped giving him power over my emotions. I released the bitterness and the hurt and the anger, and I filled that space with peace instead. That was the real victory. Not keeping the house, though that mattered. Not standing up to him when he came back, though that mattered too. The real victory was letting go. I kept the deed in my desk drawer where I could see it whenever I opened it. Margaret Louise Patterson. My name. My house. My life. Sometimes I would just look at it and smile. It represented everything I'd fought for and everything I'd become. It was proof that you can lose everything and still rebuild. That you can be abandoned and still stand strong. That you can be knocked down and still get back up. That you can start over at any age and create something beautiful. Emily got engaged that fall to a wonderful man named David. They'd been dating for 3 years, and he treated her like she hung the moon. I was so happy for her. We planned the wedding together, spending hours looking at flower arrangements and arguing good-naturedly about whether to have a sit-down dinner or a buffet. She never mentioned inviting Richard, and I never asked. He wasn't part of this. He'd missed his chance to walk her down the aisle when he walked out of her life. On her wedding day, Emily looked radiant in her white dress. I stood in the back of the church and cried happy tears. When it came time for someone to walk her down the aisle, she surprised me. She came over and took my arm. "I raised you," she whispered. "You get to give me away." I could barely see through my tears as we walked together down that aisle. My daughter. My strong, beautiful, amazing daughter. I'd done this. I'd raised her. I'd given her everything she needed to become this incredible woman. And no one could ever take that away from me. At the reception, I danced with Emily and David and all their friends. I laughed until my sides hurt. I ate too much cake. I felt light and free and full of joy. This was what life was supposed to be. Not perfect. Not without pain or struggle. But ultimately good. Ultimately worth it. I looked around at all the people celebrating with us, and I realized I'd built a whole life. A community. A family. Love. Purpose. Meaning. All of it mine. All of it earned. That night when I got home, I kicked off my heels and sat on my front porch with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, but in a good way. I looked up at the stars and I thought about how far I'd come. 20 years ago, I'd been broken and lost. Now I was whole and found. 20 years ago, I'd been afraid of being alone. Now I cherished my independence. 20 years ago, I'd defined myself by my marriage. Now I define myself by my choices, my strength, my kindness, my resilience. If I could go back and talk to that younger version of myself, the one who opened the door to find her husband gone, I would tell her this. You're going to be okay. More than okay. You're going to be amazing. You are going to discover strength you didn't know you had. You are going to build a life that makes you proud. You are going to raise a daughter who changes the world in her own small ways. You're going to learn that you don't need someone else to complete you because you are always whole on your own. And one day your ex-husband is going to show up thinking he can take back what he abandoned, and you're going to stand there with your head held high and show him that some things, once lost, can never be reclaimed. The house that Richard thought was still his had become so much more than just a building. It was a symbol of my survival. Every room held memories of struggles I'd overcome. The kitchen where I'd planned budgets on napkins. The living room where I'd helped Emily with homework. The bedroom where I'd cried myself to sleep and then woke up the next morning and kept going anyway. The garden where I'd planted seeds and watched them grow, just like I'd planted hope in myself and watched it bloom into strength. I finished my tea and went inside. I locked the door behind me, that same door Richard had knocked on trying to reclaim his past. I walked through my house turning off lights. I stopped in the hallway and looked at the photo wall I'd created over the years. Pictures of Emily at every age. Pictures of friends and holidays and ordinary beautiful moments. Pictures of a life well lived. There wasn't a single photo of Richard. Not because I was bitter, but because he simply wasn't part of this story. This was my story. Mine and Emily's. And it was a good one. I got ready for bed and lay down in my comfortable bed in my safe house in my hard-won peace. I thought about Richard one last time. I hoped he was okay, wherever he was. I hoped he'd found some kind of peace too. I hoped he'd learned from his mistakes. But mostly I hoped he'd realize that you can't run from your problems forever. Eventually you have to stop and face what you've done. And by then it might be too late to fix it. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. Some doors once closed cannot be reopened. Some chances come only once. But even in loss there can be gain. Richard lost his family and his home. I lost my marriage and my certainty about the future. But I gained myself. I gained confidence and capability, and a deep knowing that I could handle whatever life threw at me. I gained a relationship with my daughter that was built on honesty and mutual respect. I gained a home that was truly mine in every sense of the word. And I gained the knowledge that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also be the thing that sets you free. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that you are stronger than you think. When life knocks you down, you can get back up. When someone leaves you, you can learn to stand alone. When everything falls apart, you can rebuild it into something even better. Your worth is not determined by who stays or who goes. Your value is inherent. You are enough all by yourself. And no one, not even someone who once promised to love you forever, gets to come back and take away what you've built without them. The deed to my house sits in my desk drawer. Margaret Louise Patterson. Those 3 words mean everything to me. They mean I fought, and I won. They mean I survived, and I thrived. They mean I took the broken pieces of my life and created something whole and beautiful. They mean I am the author of my own story. And when Richard showed up trying to write himself back into it, I held up that deed and I said no. This story is mine. This house is mine. This life is mine. And you have no claim to any of it anymore. That's the ending I chose. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Not even a dramatic confrontation. Just quiet strength. Just a piece of paper with my name on it and the courage to stand behind it. Just the simple truth that some things cannot be taken back once they're let go. And the peace that comes from knowing you've earned every single thing you have. 20 years ago, I lost my husband. But over those 20 years, I found myself. And that trade, painful as it was, turned out to be worth it. Because the woman I became was so much stronger than the woman I was. The life I built was so much richer than the life I lost. The home I created was so much more mine than any shared space could ever be. Richard came back looking for his house. But this was never his house. Not really. Not in the ways that matter. This house was built by mortgage payments I made alone. By repairs I learned to do myself. By tears I cried into pillows in the dark. By hope I refused to give up on. By love I poured into every corner. This house was built by me. And it will always belong to me. No one can take that away. No one even gets to try.